Welcome to a new episode in our series, The Enigma of Spirituality. Today, with a special guest from California. Again, I welcome Assistant Professor Dr. Becca Tarnas. Greetings.
Greetings. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to come back and speak with you a month later.
So, today is our second talk, and we have a special site. The link will be in the description box. And we don't have to talk about the background of our guest because you can watch this very interesting talk, Astrologers in Profile, with Elena Bass. So I don't have to do this again. And our last talk is here. And today is all about Stanislav Grof. But before we start with that, copyright. I only have the right to publish the conversation uncut and unedited on free accessible video platforms, no paywalls, and on my homepages. Professor Tarnas, Professor Dr. Becca Tarnas, to be precise, has the right to shorten, edit, or add as she wishes and to publish it on her websites and video platforms according to her liking. By the way, you didn't publish it anywhere, did you? The last talk.
My plan was to wait until we had
Ah,
this conversation, and then I was going to do it in one post together.
oh, very good. Okay,
Yes.
so this is our second talk, and we start with where Stan Grof lives today. He lives in Wiesbaden in Germany. For the German viewer, you can make a session with his wife, Brigitta. This is his wife, and she is offering in Wiesbaden in Germany holotropic breathwork sessions. And there is a video with Brigitta on YouTube. You can watch this here. And she produced a biography for the 90th birthday of Stanislav Grof. It's called Stanislav Grof und das LSD von der Pharmakologie zu den Archetypen, eine Hommage zum 90. Geburtstag in 2021, and it's in English since 2023. First question, you obviously know about this project.
Mhm.
When did your research project to do a sort of scientific biography as a professor, which you are, to do a scientific biography about your friend Stanislav Grof? When did that idea came to you, and why didn't you say, okay, Brigitta did a nice work, I don't have to do that?
Well, I should clarify, Brigitta's book isn't a biography. It's actually, she calls it Stan's birthday book. She made it for his
Ah,
90th birthday. And it includes the first part is a lengthy interview that she conducted with him
ah,
about his life and career. It's a wonderful interview. It's actually been very helpful in terms of my structuring of the biography, just because he describes 5 different phases that he went through in terms of the development of his thinking, from psychopharmacology and psychoanalysis through several phases up through archetypes. And so that's the first part of the book. And then the rest is actually messages, birthday messages from his friends, family,
I see.
colleagues,
Okay.
photos from them. So it's a very personal book. And she put it together as a surprise for his 90th. And then it's since been published
Okay.
in
So
first in
that,
German, then in English.
yeah, I see. So going back, we should probably have a look at his books. Now let me see, Amaslan, that should be here.
So many books.
Yes, and there is an interesting special audio book,
Mhm.
and that is this one. How did you get implicated in that?
That is actually connected to your question about how did I get involved in the biography too, because this was back, I guess, in 2018, 2019. Well, this was published, The Way of the Psychonaut was published in 2019, and they were looking for someone to do the audiobook and went through many different professional narrators.
Wait a minute. He says
Yeah.
here Audible.de, it was published on September 2022.
That might be let's see, I did the recording for that in 2020,
Okay.
and I think it came out maybe in the States in
Oh, it's
2021.
the German thing is later. Okay. Very good.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Um, so so the book came out in 2019. They were looking for someone to do the audiobook, and they had a lot of different people try it out. All men. You typically do that. You match the gender of the narrator to the author. And I don't know. I think Stan and Brigida must have recently heard a lecture that I'd given. I've spoken, I spoke at the International Transpersonal Conference in Prague in 2017 at Stan's invitation. So he's heard me lecture before, and he knew that I knew his work very well. And I think they must have just come across a lecture of mine and thought, let's test out her voice. And so I read, several pages, made a recording, and then they really liked how it sounded with me reading it. I think not just the sound of my voice, but the issue that they had been having with the previous narrators was it was really clear they didn't understand the material. They weren't experts in the field. It's a complex field topic, a lot of terms that people aren't used to. And that was the sense that they got listening to these other narrators, that otherwise, they're wonderful professional narrators, but they just clearly didn't understand the material. And so Stan and his wife Brigitte put me forward as a name to do this, and the publishing company approved. I went down to San Diego in Southern California, recorded for 9 days. It's a 30-hour audiobook, so it's a long time to listen to my voice. I wouldn't listen to it. I can't listen to my recordings.
Okay.
And so since then, I also did the audiobook for his kind of memoir series of stories called When the Impossible Happens. And then we have another one that's in the works right now. So
Okay. But
yeah, there'll be three.
That doesn't necessarily lead to a research project of a lot of years, and it's ending in 2028 something when you want to publish your book.
Yes. So the way that came about was, this is something that had been in discussion between me and Stan and Brigitte and also Rick Tarnas, my father, that someone should write Stan's biography.
Mm-hmm.
And it first came up back in 2011. Someone should write it. He really wasn't interested in having a biography written of him by anybody back in 2011. And then I think after this last book of his came out, and in 2018, he had a stroke, which impaired his ability to communicate his own ideas. He became very interested in his legacy. What is he leaving behind? And at that point, he had a shift and thought, I would be open to having a biography written. And there were a number of other people who were colleagues, part of his community, who had been part of the International Transpersonal Association over the decades. And they were all really in support of the idea of someone writing it. And the trick was, how do you find someone who knows Grof's work very well, but also isn't so far along in their career that they have their own books or don't want to take on a project of this kind. And I was well suited for that kind of middle ground, being in my 30s, knowing his work very well, and at the same time kind of having this space for a project like this. And so in discussion with Stan and Brigitte, we basically decided, okay, I'm going to go ahead and do this. This will be an authorized biography, meaning I get to work directly with Stan, getting interviews, talking with his friends, colleagues, family members. And I've been working on it for about the last 4 years now, conducting the research and
How many
writing.
traveling did you have to do?
I did 3 big trips. The biggest one was in May of 2023. I traveled to Prague with Stan and Brigitte and also Stan's brother, Paul. They were all there. And we went all around Prague and saw, the home, the apartment building that Stan and Paul grew up in. We saw the clinic where he had his first LSD session. We Yes, please.
When I consider you in being you in Prague, did you have a portable audio recorder with you, and where during your walk you spoke all the time into the audio tape?
My husband came with us, which was wonderful in and of itself, but he has a background in documentary filmmaking. And so he had a big camera with him. And so we were recording both on this high definition camera and also on our iPhones, sometimes audio, sometimes video. So we got a lot of records from that trip.
So you got
So
all the
yeah,
information about Prague. What else happened on that trip in 2023?
we went to, we also went to the town Chechka Trebova, which is a couple hours outside of Prague, where Stan and Paul's parents met, where they grew up, where they got married. Stan actually spent several years of his early childhood living in that town. So we got to visit there and see, the old shop that used to be his grandparents' shop in the town. We got to see their home there, which, now has been converted into something else, but we were allowed to go inside. Um, we saw the forests kind of outside that area because his parents met in the woods. We got to visit, a cemetery where a lot of their family members, going back several generations, had been buried. So those were kind of the two main stops in the Czech Republic on that trip. And then we also went back to Wiesbaden and spent a little time with Stan and Brigitte in
He
their
was
home.
already living there in that year.
Yes. Yeah. He moved permanently, would have been, I think it probably would have been around 2018, 2019 after his stroke.
Oh, okay.
Um,
Okay.
he moved from the United States to live full time in
So
Wiesbaden.
this largest trip ended at Wiesbaden.
It did.
Okay.
Yeah.
What else traveling?
The other trips that I went on that were kind of specifically geared toward the biography, just a month after that one, I went to Denver where the psychedelic science conference was happening in 2023. It was, this has been held every several years and it's been growing in size. And I think this was the biggest one, over 12,000 attendees. And Stan was there. He helped lead a holotropic breathwork workshop there that had 240 participants, led by some of the best breathwork facilitators in the field that he's trained. I got to participate in the breathwork there, which was wonderful too. And, just kind of take notes on the whole event, kind of coming along, as part of the press technically, but, as his biographer. And then the last trip that I conducted was, I guess, just a few months after that. This would have been in September of 2023. And I was already traveling on the East Coast for personal reasons, East Coast of the United States for personal reasons, and went through Baltimore, Maryland, and Catonsville, which is where the Spring Grove Hospital is located, where Stan moved to the United States to work in 1967, and that's where they established the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center. The building still stands. It's not being used in the same way as it was back then. So I got to see those places. I got to, just kind of get a sense for the area where he lived from 1967 to 73. Stopped by a couple of his apartments that he lived at the time. Couldn't go inside, but, could see where they were. Visited a park where he did a lot of his writing. So those were the three big trips that I took. Another key place in the biography is Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California. I didn't take a special trip there for the biography because I know it so well.
Yes.
But it's another featured location in the biography.
So in the planning for your research project, do you have all the traveling you need to continue, or do you still plan another traveling for the research?
At this point, I have everything that I need. I have so much information. It's so beyond what's actually going to fit within the biography writing itself. I think what will happen, because I want to write this as an accessible biography. It's, probably going to, it's looking like in the end, it'll be about 400, 450 pages. I want people to read it as a narrative. And at one point I considered, okay, this could be multi-volume,
Yeah.
scholarly, track the members of every single ITA conference and who was at every
Yes.
single breathwork training.
Yesterday I mentioned to your father a biography about Proclus by Udo
Mm.
Hartmann in 3 volumes, and it's 2,200 pages. Why not doing the same thing?
It certainly could be done. I have all the research to do it, but I made the decision that I wanted Stan Grof's story to be accessible to people beyond those who already know of him or the
Oh,
field of
okay.
psychedelic research. And so I think I'm a storyteller at heart, and that's how I've approached it. But I have the information available, and I think that what I'd like to do when the biography is complete is I'll probably, with maybe the help of some research assistants or other people who are interested, put together a website with this information. So if someone wanted to come along and write a 3 volume version later on based on what I have, they absolutely could.
But you don't intend to do that yourself, because that could be a continuation of your professional work, academic work in CIIS. You could do a new project, the rest of the material in another format, but books also, you don't intend to do books about the rest of the material.
I don't. I really see this as a singular project that I'm putting everything into right now. And then I have other books that I want to write in other
Okay.
fields and
Okay.
genres. Yeah.
Do you intend to do seminars when the book is published about the book?
Very likely. I definitely plan on, touring the book, talking about it on podcasts. This is the first conversation I've had that's fully devoted to talking about
Okay.
Grof's work. It's come up in some other podcasts, but this is the first one where it's been completely devoted to it, kind of a preview of what's coming.
Okay.
Um,
So
but I
you
already teach courses on Grof's work at my graduate institute.
so after the book is published, you will do a seminar, which will be the 3 mandatory books from his books he wrote.
Mm,
What are the 3 most important books out of the books that you can buy on Amazon? What would be the third most important, the second most important, and what would be the most important book, mandatory reading for students who attend your seminar about the biography of Stan Grof?
mm.
What would you choose?
Well, I can answer this from two different directions because there's the books I already assign when I teach on Grof. But then there's the ones that I think are absolutely essential to read. So let me start with the ones I think are absolutely essential to read. Um, the first book that Grof wrote, which was um, a manuscript that was never published in the form that he wrote it, it had a few different titles, but it's called The Agony and Ecstasy um, of Psychedelic Treatment, something like that. There's a few different titles. And he ended up splitting that into 5 different books. And the first of those came out in 1975, Realms of the Human Unconscious. And I would say that is where to start. The second book is very hard to get one's hands on. It's called The Human Experience of Death, or The Human Encounter with Death. And he co-authored it with his wife at the time, Joan Halifax. And that was based on his research at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, working with Walter Pahnke, where they were doing sessions with terminally ill cancer patients. And he learned a lot about the experience of death and dying, approaching death, the survival of consciousness beyond death, things like this. So that was the second book. The third one, which is actually about to be re-released in its 5th edition, is LSD Psychotherapy. This
Mhm.
is the book for people who are most interested in Grof's method, the actual clinical method he used both in Prague using psycholytic therapy, and then in the United States using what's called psychedelic therapy. It's essentially many low dose sessions compared to just a few very high dose sessions. And that is the book where he lays out the actual technique approach kind of in a very scientific way. This is the book that maps the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Science, the one that they use as one of the foundations for their clinical research studies. So those two, Realms of the Human Unconscious and LSD Psychotherapy, these are some of Grof's earliest books and lay out his theory in a very clear, scientific, accessible way. Now, and then to finish up, the last two that came out of that initial or manuscript, as we refer to it, was Beyond the Brain, where he puts forward a very clear argument for consciousness not being generated in the brain or an epiphenomenon of the brain, but extending beyond matter. And then the last one, which didn't come out till the late 90s, is called The Cosmic Game. Even though he wrote an essay of that same name back in 1972, that lays out the metaphysical implications of the experiences that he saw in his clinical research. So the kinds of spiritual encounters that people have, the conclusions about the nature of reality and the divine and so forth. Again, not that he imposed onto these sessions, but that he actually saw reported to him by his patients and then saw common threads between them. So those are the five that came out of that initial manuscript. And those are really the ones I'd recommend, those five. They're central to his theories and they're beautifully written. Now, that being said, when I teach him his work in my graduate seminars, I tend to choose books that are more summarizing of his work. So his last book, this 2-volume Way of the Psychonaut, that kind of summarizes everything. And then students can go into greater depth with these other books I've mentioned. Another one that's very good at summarizing his work in a little bit more of a condensed form is called The Psychology of the Future. That's the one I would say to someone, like, if you just want one book, about 300 pages, you want to get a sense for all of Grof's work, read The Psychology of the Future. That's a great entrance. And then you can go where you want, depending on, what might spark your interest as a reader. So those are my recommendations.
Why didn't you recommend this one?
Well, that one isn't by Grof. So I guess that's why I didn't recommend it. This is a beautiful Festschrift in honor of Stan Grof. It was edited by Rick Tarnas and Sean Kelly. It was about 20 years in the making. There's essays in it that, go all the way back several decades, from Houston Smith, from Joseph Campbell, all the way up through contemporary scholars looking at Grof's work. So that is a book I also assign in one of my classes, because it's a great way to hear other voices speaking about Grof's work and the way that it's come into their fields of research and so forth.
How do you see the reception in Americas, United States, not the rest of the world? How about the reception of these books in the academic sphere of different disciplines? Do you have any impression how his books were received in different faculties?
In the academic sphere and in the medical sphere, he's been largely dismissed. Okay. He's really pushing, his goal was to push the paradigm in the fields of psychiatry, psychology, and psychotherapy to expand the framework that was being used in those fields. And because his methodology for doing that is something that was made illegal in the 1970s, it really cut off the ability to go back and verify the validity of his scientific research. So, and he also went on to develop holotropic breath work as a way of giving people experiences working with non-ordinary or expanded states of consciousness without needing to rely on psychedelics. We can talk more about holotropic breath work, but I think because he spent so many decades in the field of holotropic breathwork trainings, workshops, and so on, he became better known for that. I think if a lot of people, when they hear Grof's name, think, oh yeah, the guy who does holotropic breathwork, not the guy who put out several decades of highly detailed clinical research that expands our understanding of the human unconscious. And so that's been, I think, part of his reception history at this point, that I certainly would like to see shift in the coming decades, but I think that'll take time just because academia is operating in a different paradigm than the paradigm Grof ended up in. Not the one where he started. That's why I think his story is so interesting. But at this point, you won't find Grof taught in many graduate schools and so on. Now, with the psychedelic renaissance, he has been brought forward as someone whose research is very valuable. As I said, his book, LSD Psychotherapy, has been used as a foundation for developing the clinical trials. But in many ways, it is still at odds with what psychedelics themselves are at odds with how many scientific clinical trials work and how psychopharmacology unfolds. And Grof was clear about this very early in his career. He realized psychedelics do not fall in the same category as typical psychopharmacological substances, because if you give someone a particular substance that's supposed to make them to make them vomit or something, that's going to happen most of the time when you give it to them. You can repeat these trials. You give someone a dose of LSD, you can't replicate either between individuals or across individuals the same results every time. It's going to be different. And one of the things he details in his very first book is there isn't a single common denominator across all the thousands of sessions, not only that he's conducted, but other researchers have conducted, that underlie the LSD experience. He said the closest we get to that is dilated pupils. And even then, there are some people who don't have dilated pupils. Otherwise, the diversity of experience is so broad. Yes, we can kind of give a sense for what might happen, but there's nothing that's there 100% of the time. And that's very different than psychopharmacology.
But you have a research field which wasn't touched yet, I believe, because you have this astrological approach with the transits
Mm-hmm.
to prognosticate what will happen in a certain individual case. And you could do research searching for people who have comparable horoscopes. And if you
Mm-hmm.
have two people with sort of born on the same day in the same area, and then you give them both the dose, then my speculation would be there should be something happening alike. Would you
Mm-hmm.
agree on that?
I would agree on that, that when you have people with very similar charts going through, similar transits, that should be exactly the case. And because of the research that Stan Grof did with Rick Tarnas, looking at how we can actually use transit astrology in particular, but also natal astrology to get a sense for what will unfold in a session archetypally. We have everything there to do a big study along these lines. And it's really just a matter of getting the funding and the right people involved to be able to conduct such a study, which I really think should happen.
For the viewers, the reason why I stood up and got a little bit more light is because the light will get less and less and less because we are at the moment in the starting points of the solar eclipse, totally in Spain and in Hanover, where I am, Hanover, Germany, it's an 87% solar eclipse. So don't be surprised if the light dims and then comes back again. And that gives me a break for our talk because we talked about it beforehand. How do you see a solar eclipse in your personal life? How do you use those solar eclipses to do videos or to do it not? To do
Sure.
something or to do something not? How about your personal approach to solar eclipses, even if you are not in the central zone?
Mm. So my approach to eclipses has been evolving as I learn more and experience more. I have I have found eclipses to be extremely beautiful numinous events I got to witness the total solar eclipse that crossed the US back in 2017. And again, it was one of the most numinous celestial experiences I've ever encountered. I think the only thing comparable to it is the few times that I've seen the aurora borealis, which is also just extraordinary.
Yes.
I have a deep respect for eclipses for that reason. The feeling I had when watching the eclipse in 2017 was being witness to a cosmological lovemaking, this conjunctio of the solar and lunar. There's a talk on YouTube that my dad, Rick Tarnas, and I gave in 2017, right before that eclipse, talking about solar light, lunar light. We talked about the solar feminine and solar masculine, the lunar feminine and the lunar masculine. But I'm aware that there's a lot of traditions that see eclipses as malefic events, an eclipsing of the light. And, people will try not to schedule things during an eclipse or
Like us today, because we
like us
scheduled it.
today.
We together scheduled it right in the middle of the solar eclipse.
We did. And, I knew this eclipse was happening, and this isn't the only event that I tried to plan around this eclipse without I have some kind of strange connection to this eclipse, which I'll just say that my husband and I, as archetypal astrologers, have planned the timing of our children's births as best you can. It's a complex practice. We did that with our first child, and he happened to be born, within the 24-hour window that we were aiming for, which was kind of extraordinary. Obviously, he wanted to be born then.
That's unusual good. Yeah, that's true.
It was unusual.
Congratulations for that.
It was a beautiful chart, and he's, turning into a beautiful expression of that. And
How
so
about you're pregnant right now in the last stage in the 8th month? How about that? Did you do that again?
so I originally saw the transits for today, and completely fell in love with them and thought this is when I want my second child to be born. And somehow,
Which doesn't happen today.
which doesn't happen today, I
Mm.
really hope, because that would be a month early.
Yeah.
But I
So
somehow didn't make
if your
note.
baby comes during our session, I will understand.
I really hope not, because I'm 35 and a half weeks pregnant, which is about a week and a half away from the safe window to give birth. Um, but it was just so funny because I usually, I'm tracking that, this is an eclipse, but somehow I fell in love with these transits, and I saw it as a new moon and didn't make note that it was an eclipse. And then a while later realized, oh my goodness, it's an eclipse. And to kind of sum up, this baby was like, nope, I'm not coming at this time. And I
Okay.
happened to get pregnant a month later. So this baby is like, let's wait one more month, happens to be aligning with the new moon again, in terms of the due date. We'll see what actually unfolds. But so I was already unconscious of this eclipse then, and kind of made a mistake in my planning. And then when we were scheduling these sessions, I was doing it primarily based on what I had available in my calendar, and
Yes, yes.
wanting to spread it apart about a month. And I knew I had Wednesday mornings open, so it was very practical. And then as we were getting closer, I was like, it's not only is it an eclipse, it's the same eclipse. And so the reason that I'm a little more cautious now than I was maybe back in 2017 or earlier is that I've just had enough experiences during eclipses, not necessarily of something going terribly wrong, but I often don't feel physically well during them. There's a feeling of kind of heaviness.
How do you feel now at this moment?
Well, since we started speaking, I've been feeling better than I was earlier today. And as we've talked about, I'm 8 months pregnant, so there's all kinds of things that can feel physically difficult anyway at that point. But I've had a kind of pressure in my head since yesterday. felt a little kind of queasy and so forth. So it's, and there's some personal things that have been coming up in the last couple of days that have just been challenging, required my attention, a little more stressful. And so I was like, of course, I missed the eclipse again. So we'll see. This eclipse and I seem to have an unconscious relationship to each other in some ways. But if I could be talking with anyone, you're a lovely person to be recording with at this time.
And in about half an hour, it will be total, I suppose. It should be.
Yeah.
It should start to be 20 hours German time. So we'll see, because we'll see when the light gets less and less and less. So we don't have to talk about that anymore. We just
All right.
watch it on the sidelines. So I wanted to start before we come to the questions. I wanted to do something about this shift thing.
Oh yeah.
What is that? Because you are involved with that.
I am. This is a beautiful offering that the Shift Network has put together. It's just pure chance that the little town where I live, Nevada City, California, is also where the founders of the Shift Network live.
Oh,
So
okay. So you can have coffee together.
we can have coffee together.
Okay.
Yeah, the Stephen Dinan founded it, and so he lives up here with his family. And I think that most of the business is still based in the Bay Area, but I feel like they're a local local organization.
What is
But
it? What is that network? What is Shift?
Shift Network is an online platform that offers courses, workshops, one-off events in this is their terminology. They call it deep woo. But I actually, even though they use that term, I feel like it kind of does a disservice to the breadth of what they're offering. A lot of different spiritual practices, teachings from different esoteric and mystical traditions. There's, a lot of astrology and herbalism and depth psychology. And so Stan Grof has actually offered, I believe, 2 courses through them before. One of them was a collaboration with Rick Tarnas, where they were teaching on their joint work together. And this offering is, Stan came across a well-preserved recording of a day-long seminar that he offered at Spirit Rock. Spirit Rock is the Vipassana center founded by Jack Kornfield up here in Northern California. It's in Marin County. And so Stan offered a day-long seminar there called The Cosmic Game, based on that book of the same name. And this recording is just beautiful. It's kind of an amazing archival teaching that just got unearthed this year. And he and Brigitte thought, we have to share this. We have to bring this out. It's, I think about 5 or 6 hours long. And so they offered it to the Shift Network, who put together an event where they've divided the seminar across 7 days, or across 7 weeks, 7 classes. And then they brought in for each one experts in the field of consciousness research, colleagues, friends of Grof's. So Jack Kornfield, again, who hosted the original event, Chris Beisch, Paul Grof, Stan's brother, Diane Haug, who's one of the kind of leaders and facilitators in holotropic breathwork and the Grof legacy training, Will Keepan and Cynthia Bricks, who started the Gender Equity and Reconciliation International organization that does really beautiful work healing between men and women. Breathwork is part of their offerings and their trainings. And then the whole thing is being hosted by Jay Dufreshu, who is another one of the facilitators in the Grof legacy training. I'm part of it. Rick Tarnas is part of it. So I actually just last week had my class with Paul Grof, which was lovely. Paul Grof is one of my favorite people in the world. He's been so wonderful to work with on this biography project. And he's a psychiatrist. He's worked a lot with patients with depression and so forth. And so it's an offering that is currently happening right now. There's still, I think, 4 weeks left in it. And
And you are planned for the 2nd of September, I believe.
I am, knock on wood, that's 10 days before my due date. So I did tell them I may not be there, but
You
that's
you
why
might you might get your baby right on that session.
yes, again, I hope not. But it's always a possibility.
What are you doing on the 2nd of September?
This will be the last class, and so the way the format works is they play a segment. I think it'll be about an hour-long segment from this initial recording, and then on that last day, Stan and Brigitte will be there, as well as Rick Tarnas and myself.
What does
And
that mean? They come to Nevada City?
no, the whole event's online.
Oh, okay,
So
okay,
yeah,
okay.
it's all run through Zoom. Shift does. I love working with them because they just do everything so professionally, and the way things are facilitated with the audience is just lovely. And so we're there basically to be in dialogue with each other about the material, and then to answer any questions that come up from the audience.
And at the moment, you are not working at CIIS, I assume, or are you?
I am. It's summer break right now,
Okay,
so and then this fall I'll be on maternity leave.
okay. And not
Yeah,
so long as in Germany, which is bad, but that's the United States. Okay. Um, let's see. Now we can dive into the questions for today about your research.
sure.
And it starts here. The questions are on the subside, special talk side, and the link is in the description box. Question one, early life information. How would you elaborate on this question?
Absolutely. So looking at Stan's childhood in Prague during the Second World War, and also with the communist takeover beginning in 1948. I mean, there's so many ways to answer this question, and I think some of those answers I'll save for the biography, to tempt readers towards it. But two answers come to mind regarding this. One in terms of his childhood. Um, so his parents, when they got engaged, when they wanted to get married, uh, his mother was raised Catholic, and there was a Catholic church in the town where they grew up, Chechka Trebova, and they wanted to get married in the church, but Stan's father was considered a pagan, and his family was without religion, and the church basically said, "We're not going to marry you here. We're not going to oversee a marriage between a Catholic and someone we perceive as a pagan, or someone having no religion." And it seemed like the wedding wasn't going to happen. They were devastated until Stan's mother's parents um, figured out a solution, which was they made a large donation to the church. And
Money,
the
money, money
Mhm.
speaks. Okay,
Money
money
speaks.
speaks. Okay.
And then all of a sudden there was no problem. And they got
Oh,
married, and they had a lovely wedding. And but Stan's parents were so disgusted by this whole experience that they decided that they were going to raise their children without religion, and that they would grow up, basically, that when they were old enough, they could choose if they wanted to go into a particular religion, explore spirituality. And so, when Stan was going through his education and there were courses on religion, he would sit those ones out. He had permission from his parents to miss those classes, and he would go do something else. And I think that this was a really essential, formative part of who he is, that he wasn't indoctrinated in any religion. And I think it makes a lot of sense that he went towards the sciences early in his career. And, because he was studying medicine and psychiatry in communist Czechoslovakia at the time, there's also a very strong materialist agenda that is part of the communist regime. So he, on the one hand, is approaching all this material without any religious indoctrination, and on the other hand, has a deep interest in spirituality. And so when his patients, and also he himself, were undergoing their LSD sessions, and having very numinous, mystical, spiritual experiences, I think this inevitably drew his curiosity. And on the one hand, he wasn't preconditioned to interpret them in a one particular religious lens. But on the other hand, that deep curiosity allowed him to really approach such spiritual experiences with an empirical scientific lens. And I think we see that having an effect all the way through his career. So that's one answer I would give.
Question 2, choosing psychiatry.
He chose psychiatry. It was a very sudden change, actually. Stan, if you ask Paul what his earliest memories of his older brother are, it's that he was always drawing. And Stan wanted to become a film animator. He loved Disney films. He would watch, Disney shorts that were playing at a cinema near their home in the later 1930s. This was when the earliest Disney feature-length films were coming out, like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Pinocchio, Fantasia. He became very interested in other animators and puppetry and so forth. And so as he was in his late teens and reaching the point of choosing a career, this is what he wanted to go into. He actually already had an internship lined up. And then his closest friend, Milan, showed up at his house and said, "I've been reading this book. You have to read it. It's going to change your life." And that book was Freud's Introductory Lectures on Psychoanalysis.
Okay.
Stan read it overnight in one sitting, was absolutely fascinated, and decided on the spot, I'm going to go into psychiatry. Because now being able to study psychoanalysis in communist Czechoslovakia was pretty much impossible. The psychoanalysts were underground at that point. Freud's books were locked away in libri prohibiti, banned book libraries, basically. I don't know how Milan got a copy of the book, but so the closest he could get to psychoanalysis, and he did end up working with a psychoanalyst for quite a few years as a therapist and learning from him, kind of underground, but the closest he could get was psychiatry. So he went to psychiatry, went to medical school, and just had this extraordinary pivot away from animation, although the artistry always stayed with him.
Question 3, the first LSD experience.
So this is a story that Stan has told many times in his books. Usually starts off the vast majority of his books detailing the experience, where and so I won't go into too much detail because this is a very accessible story. He had been watching other patients have LSD sessions for about 2 years at the clinic where he worked while he was still in medical school, but he wasn't allowed to have one as a student. So as soon as he graduated, he signed up to have his experience. And at the core of the experience was the preceptor of the clinic where he worked was very interested in something called driving the brain waves. And they would hook up all the patients to an EEG machine and would blast the patient when they're at the height of their LSD experience with a bright stroboscopic light. And so the time arrived for Stan to have this measurement taken, to have his brain waves driven. And the moment that light touched his eyes, he was completely blasted out of his body. And his experience was, leaving the identity of being Stan Grof, leaving the clinic, leaving Prague, leaving the earth, and becoming part of what he would later identify as experiencing the unfolding of cosmogenesis, the evolution of the cosmos itself. And the conclusion that he came to following this experience, he described it as, in becoming nothing, I became everything. And his conclusion from this experience was that consciousness is beyond matter, that consciousness may be even generating our experience of matter. Now, this is in November of 1956 that this happens, and is completely at odds with the materialist worldview that he has been educated within and that he holds in his kind of conscious awareness. And so I think that that initial experience ended up planting the seed for what he would eventually find the empirical evidence for in the thousands of clinical sessions that he sat for over the course of the next couple decades in his career. But I think that seed of doubting the primacy of matter and rather seeing consciousness as primary, it was planted then. But to actually arrive at really not just believing that, but knowing it took decades of breaking down his old paradigms. And that was all done through clinical research.
In our last talk, we were talking about your first LSD experience, and that was around 2011, right?
It was in 2011. Yeah.
And your father was sort of a little bit earlier. Did you talk about your experience with your father, Richard Tarnas, and how different your experiences were? Or
How different?
how alike they were? How the two experiences, Richard Tarnas and Becca Tarnas, both LSD experience. What was the similarity and what was the difference?
I think that there was a lot more in common between my experience and my dad's experiences with LSD than, say, mine and Stan Grof's. And that is that we both had experiences, encounters with the archetypes. And
How do you explain this? By biological being daughter and father, or another explanation?
that's a tricky one, isn't it? Because
Yeah, it's interesting.
there could be a biological element, but I think maybe there's also some perhaps kind of karmic predisposition towards that too.
How about you being the priestess and he being the priest of a spiritual magical approach, like Yamblikus?
Uh, I mean, I don't think that those are necessarily terms either of us would uh, dawn upon ourselves.
Well, I put them on you
But
because they are applicable. In the talk yesterday with your father, we were talking about the magic of Yamblikus and Proklos and the connection to the gods. And your
yeah,
experience was a connection to the gods. So why not call you the priestess and him the priest of the gods?
it's definitely been beyond both of us in terms of me being drawn into the same field of not just work, but experience as him. I
Okay.
think it's something that equally surprised us. And, it wasn't ever my plan to become an astrologer, to, uh, you know, dive into research on psychedelics and consciousness and so
But
forth. That was his domain.
but that's the way the gods work, because even if you
Yeah.
don't know what you're going to become, the gods make it happen. And
Yeah.
after this LSD experience, the gods who you
Yeah.
were confronted with made sure that you became an astrologer, right?
They did. They made it very clear that this is what I was supposed to be doing.
Yes. So why not
Yeah.
priestess? You're a priestess of the gods.
Well, I think I'm touched by the the phrase and the term, and I think in my own identification, well, that's deeply connected to my own spiritual experiences and encounters. Um, I leave it for others
Yes.
to use such names and
I will use it.
identify myself as an academic.
I will continue to use it because it doesn't disturb my career. It might disturb your career if you would put I am the priestess of the gods. That might not be so good for your career.
I don't think so. I don't think in the field I'm in that's taken all that seriously, but it's definitely become, um, one of the primary intentions I have whenever I teach is, can I offer students uh, an understanding and an encounter with the archetypes that they will know that this is the genuine structure of reality.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Question 4. The
All
scientific
right.
climate of the 50s and 60s.
Mm. Yes. I mean, this was a really interesting time to be doing research into psychedelic substances. Stan Grof describes the 1950s in particular as the golden age of psychopharmacology. This is when tranquilizers are being developed, antidepressants, um, and there was a very strong desire to be able to the nut to crack was schizophrenia. Can we figure out what causes it, and can we find a cure? And with LSD, because it was um, such a minuscule amount of the substance was needed to have such a big effect,
It was
they thought,
500 milligrams, right?
well, you can have an experience on far less micrograms, not milligrams,
Oh, micrograms. Okay.
micrograms. 500 is what we call a heroic dose.
Oh,
Um,
okay. Okay. I
you can
didn't
have an
know.
experience. For example, you can start to see distortions of the visual field, colors, and so on, as low as 25 micrograms. I mean, this
Okay.
is minuscule. The
Yes.
first intentional experience anyone ever had with LSD is Albert Hofmann, who synthesized the substance, and he thought he was taking a very, very conservative dose, 250 micrograms,
Mm-hmm.
which, as Stan Grof will talk about, anyone who's worked with LSD knows 250 micrograms, you need multiple sessions of preparation. You need a sitter through the whole time. And here, Albert Hofmann was thinking that this would, maybe nothing will happen. And it was a huge experience. So,
Yeah.
because it's so effective, it's such a um, minute quantity, they thought, well, maybe there's something like that going on in the body that causes schizophrenia. They called it toxin X. And this was the goal. Okay, if we can study LSD, maybe we can find toxin X, maybe we can find a cure. That didn't happen. But what did open up was research into LSD and other psychedelic substances that allowed a deepening into an understanding of the human unconscious and the psyche. And Stan Grof wrote a very pivotal paper in 1959 after several years of doing psychopharmacological research with LSD, where they were doing it in a setting of you give someone a dosage and then you're um, measuring their heart rate and breathing and pupil dilation and taking urine samples and blood samples. He said, this is the worst possible condition to have any kind of a mystical experience in. And still some people did. Um, but the conclusion he came to was this isn't psychopharmacology. This is a non-specific amplifier of the psyche. And that this actually, as some other researchers were coming to realize at the same time, this can be used in psychology and psychiatry rather than, or particularly, I should say, in psychology and psychotherapy, rather than the way they were trying to use it in psychiatry as a kind of cure for understanding the origin of schizophrenia and psychosis. So it was a really interesting time to be doing this research, especially where he was in the 1950s and most of the 60s, behind the Iron Curtain, because there was a lot of interest in curing psychoses and a lot of funding available to be able to actually work with patients over and over again. So when Stan was head of the Psychiatric Research Institute in Prague, running he wasn't head of the Psychiatric Research Institute, he was head of the psychedelic research that was being conducted there, working with LSD. And he worked with about maybe 100 patients over those years, doing anywhere from 15 to 100 sessions. I mean, this is something unheard of in, say, the United States and the clinical trials being done today. They're like, you get 3 sessions, that's it. And it was the same when he came to the United States in 1967 to work in Baltimore at the Spring Grove Hospital. It was this huge cultural shift, because in Prague, if you wanted an LSD session, let's say you're an artist or philosopher, you just come to the clinic, you sign up, you get to have an experience. In the United States, you have street acid and you have Tim Leary and the whole kind of explosion of this revolutionary counterculture. And very quickly, all the legitimate research at the institutions is being shut down. And so by the time Stan gets there, there's one surviving project left researching LSD psychotherapy, and he joins that project. They lasted a little bit longer than everyone else because it was part of the National Institute of Mental Health. So they had government funding. And Stan left that research project in 1973. The last session conducted there was in 1977, but really everything was being shut down at that point. So in terms of that scientific climate, you really just kind of see such a rapid kind of movement from hope of, wow, what could this offer us? And psychedelics being explored in clinics and research institutes and the academy to, oh, this is completely taboo. This has taken over the counterculture, and research being shut down eventually all around the world.
And that leads to question 5. And what patterns or discoveries stand out? What would you say?
So the patterns that really stood out in terms of what Grof theorized, and I know that this leads into a couple of the follow-up questions that you have. He started working with essentially a Freudian model of the unconscious. So the understanding that the unconscious is shaped by our biographical experiences, particularly childhood, particularly the relationship to the parents. And at first, when he started doing psycholytic psychotherapy in Prague, it was playing out like a test case for Freudian psychoanalysis. He couldn't believe, he was amazed at how what people were experiencing in their sessions was kind of this, they described it as an onion peeling of the psyche, just going back layer through layer of the biography, recovering repressed memories from their childhood that explained their diagnoses and so forth, until their experiences kept peeling back to a threshold that wasn't in his training. And that was very convincing reports from his patients. First, that they felt like they were dying. They would say things like, this isn't a session anymore. We have, I'm really dying. You have to take me to the emergency room. And you check their vitals and they'd be fine. And those experiences, when people surrendered to feeling like they were dying, they would actually simultaneously in that dying experience feel like they were being born. And so this was the first layer that he uncovered in his research, what he called the perinatal domain of the unconscious. Realizing that we have our memory of birth unconsciously stored and accessible to us. And at first he thought, well, this is still biologically based. We're forgetting that we have this experience, but clearly we can uncover it again. And he was able to verify that these were genuine relivings of birth too, by checking in with, the patient's parents or other family members who could say, oh yes, their birth did unfold like that, or that happened at that time. And seeing all these extraordinary connections between an area in the birth experience where something maybe went wrong, like, their shoulder stuck in the birth canal, or the umbilical cord is wrapped around the neck, and then seeing how those experiences actually reflected later pathologies that these patients were dealing with in some kind of symbolic way, or that there were many later life experiences that also reflected that their birth experience. So he draws the origin of psychopathologies out of just the biographical domain to the perinatal, to the birth experience. But then it keeps going. And this is where eventually he had to move beyond. Oh, the eclipse is really darkening things over there. Turning a light on. Perfect timing as we move to the transpersonal domain of the unconscious. And this is when he realized that people could have experiences. Again, first, it often seemed biologically based. They were having very genuine experiences of being, the sperm in the ovum, or being cells in the body, or their ancestors, maybe being their grandparents or someone further back in their lineage, or the experience of being entire cultures. But soon that started to move beyond just the person's biographical and ancestral lineage to experiences of being people in other cultures, or experiences that felt very convincingly like past life memories, or experiences of being different animals or plants, or biological processes. And he really was trying to trace this, again, biologically, materially. He's thinking, okay, someone's having a really genuine experience of being a jaguar or a whale. Maybe somehow their consciousness is able to trace up the DNA, but then come back down a different evolutionary branch. Like he's trying to stay within the frameworks he's learned, until it just kind of becomes impossible to stick with the biological, as he's seeing more and more evidence of people having experiences either that are completely outside of their biological lineage, or that are beyond biology itself, or even beyond consensus reality itself. As we were talking about a moment ago, encounters with deities, with archetypal figures, with mythological sequences from not only their own culture, but others, sometimes cultures and mythological sequences that the patients have never even heard of. Experiences of, divine unity, oneness, the metacosmic void, absolute consciousness. So all of this, everything that I'm describing, from the experience of being a cell to the experience of, becoming one with the divine, he categorized under this vast domain that he called transpersonal experience, beyond the personal. And that's really the point where he started to have to reconcile with the fact that consciousness may not be reliant on the substratum of matter. And the really valuable thing about Grof's research that is not replicable in our world today, those 7 years when he was working with patients in Prague at the Psychiatric Research Institute behind the Iron Curtain, because there was such limitation on the knowledge available, on the books that were available, on exposure to different religious or mythic traditions. It was an example of how all of these things were emerging through people that they had no exposure to. Today, we couldn't replicate that because we have the internet, because we're so much more interconnected, because we're exposed to so many images through, film and so forth, that it's really just this treasure trove that he had available at that time because of the limitations, interestingly. And it was only years later that he would sometimes verify, this mythology that patient experience comes from, this culture that they'd never had an encounter with and never could have. So it really shows how consciousness has access to experiences that are not something we've been exposed to previously. It goes against the tabula rasa idea that we're born as a blank slate, and then everything that we know comes through the senses or life experience. It just, the evidence flies in the face of that. So longer answer to that one, but it seemed worth going into.
And sort of answer to question 6 as well, isn't it?
It is, although here's something really interesting that I didn't even realize about Grof until I started researching his biography. Grof is deeply shaped by Freud. I knew that, beginning with reading the introductory lectures, turning to psychiatry and psychoanalysis because of that. And then in some ways, his whole unfolding process through his research was moving through Freud. Rick Tarnas has actually said he feels that Freud is the birth canal that Grof had to struggle through through his own ideas. But Jung was banned. You could not access Jung in Czechoslovakia under the communist regime. He never read Jung until he came to the United States. But at that point, he'd already formulated the basic perinatal matrices, which is his understanding of the perinatal domain and the process of birth as we relive it. He'd already formulated the idea of the transpersonal domain. Then he comes to the States and reads Jung, and that Jung's idea of the collective unconscious and so forth perfectly affirms what he's been seeing in his clinical research, but he wasn't shaped by it, which I think is a really, again, the conditions that he was working in actually really helped verify just the veracity of these experiences, because he's not having this exposure to, whether it's Jungian ideas or his patients aren't being exposed to many myths and religions and stories and so forth. And yeah, that's a test case we can't replicate.
Question 7, mapping the psyche.
I mean, I think this is a lot of what I was just describing, where he introduces these two domains, additional domains of the perinatal and the transpersonal. His first book is called Realms of the Human Unconscious. And this is what he's introducing, these new realms, saying, no, the human unconscious goes beyond the Freudian biographical. And so, yeah, I think that does kind of cover some of these other questions around transpersonal experience. The basic perinatal matrices are the four stages of the birth process that he would see patients relive. And sometimes they'd go through them in order. Sometimes they'd go through just one. They'd be out of order. And these matrices, they relate to the four clinical stages of birth. And then what Grof recognized through the clinical research was associated with each of these stages. The first being the intrauterine state, that the fetus, that the baby is experiencing, kind of being merged with the mother's body. The second stage being the onset of labor itself, when contractions begin, but before the cervix has fully ripened and opened. The third stage being the passage through the birth canal itself, which is very much a life-death struggle. And then the fourth stage being the actual moment of birth itself, the baby's separation from the mother's body, the sense of liberation and contextualization of that struggle, and then ideally a reuniting with the mother. So those are the four clinical stages. And what Grof saw and laid out in a table that he wrote beginning in 1966 was all the different associated transpersonal and mythological experiences associated with those matrices, where people would struggle maybe in one matrix. They'd kind of be caught in the complex of that matrix. That would directly reflect their psychopathological diagnosis and so forth. So it was a very interesting kind of categorization of these experiences that he theorized, again, drawing on these hundreds, actually thousands of patient records at that time.
And in 2000, in the World Conference for Astrology, in a webinar, he was associating those four stages with Neptune, Saturn, Pluto, and Uranus.
Yes.
And people can read about this elsewhere. Now, question number 10.
Hmm.
What what is his vision for the future about this problem?
I think because Grof came up through a scientific background and his scientific research demonstrated to him the reality of spiritual experience. He does see them as being compatible, that there is a relationship between the two. And, what he came to find through his research was, um, he was educated in such a fashion that the experiences described in religious and mystical traditions, but also coming out of shamanic cultures, indigenous cultures, uh, those um, those cosmologies and those worldviews were largely dismissed by the Western scientific paradigm. Just it's superstitious, it's fanciful, it's made up, it's naive, it's magical thinking. And what he came to using a scientific method, using empirical research, working with patients, taking LSD, in this clinical setting was an affirmation of these mystical, religious, shamanic worldviews, which gave him a great deal of respect for all these cultures and these traditions. He even said at one point, in one of the interviews that he did, that he felt like he needed to apologize on behalf of this Western materialist scientific paradigm for the attitude of dismissal towards these cultures and traditions. And so I think that's why he sees science and spirituality as being ultimately compatible, because it was his own direct experience that science opened up an understanding of spirituality that, again, he wasn't raised with. So I think that's how he sees them being in relationship.
We can skip question 11, I think, and we
Yeah, I
can
think we got that in
and
the kind of arc.
we got the 12 as well.
Mm-hmm.
How about the birth of holotropic breathwork?
So holotropic breathwork was developed, as we've been talking about, in the early 1970s. Very quickly, the research into LSD and other psychedelics is shut down in the United States, which is where Stan was working at the time, but really all around the world, that wave um, went pretty rapidly, shutting down all this research, making these substances illegal. And Stan left Baltimore. He left the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center there because he had been invited by Michael Murphy, one of the founders of Esalen Institute and Big Sur, to come be scholar in residence there. And Stan at the time was working on his first book, and he was going to be taking a leave of absence from his clinical research anyway. And so Michael Murphy invites him out to come to Esalen and basically says, we'll give you a house, come stay at Esalen. And in exchange for that, you can teach, workshops occasionally. That's kind of your exchange for us. And, work on writing your books, which was an amazing offering that Stan took up. And so while he was there, he moved out there in fall of 1973, and he started teaching workshops. And in those first couple of years, he's teaching these workshops, describing what his research uncovered, the theories and so forth. But the reflection he was always getting from participants was, okay, well, we want these experiences. But he couldn't just, LSD was illegal. He couldn't give them those experiences. And at the time, people were already doing breath work at Esalen in other workshops, different, there's ancient breathwork practices like pranayama and so forth. And in 1975, Stan met Christina, who became his wife, Christina Grof. And she was a very practiced yogini, and with a lot of experience in breathwork. And it was in collaboration with her experience in breathwork, coming out of the yoga tradition, and also something that Stan witnessed in his LSD sessions, which is that sometimes an LSD session would end before the material that was coming up felt fully resolved for the person. And so the actual substance would be leaving their body, but just innately, intuitively, they would start breathing more deeply. And in that process of breathing more deeply, they would actually reactivate the expanded state of consciousness again and would be able to kind of complete whatever was coming up. And he saw that in enough sessions that they put these ideas together and thought, well, what if we create an experience where people are doing deep breathing in the way that he saw at the end of the LSD sessions, but also, drawing on these other breathwork traditions. And we do it in a setting where you have a whole group of people breathing together, do it to very loud, evocative, potent music. And also another piece that came out of Grof's clinical experience was the way that body work could sometimes help release stuck energy or emotions. If someone was feeling like a lot of pain in their shoulder, then if one puts kind of increased pressure there, it often would create a kind of cathartic release. And he noticed this again in the LSD sessions. There's one story he tells where there was someone who had an intense pain in their stomach and asked that Stan push on it. And so he did, and the patient vomited profusely and then felt better, and the pain was released. And so the combination of these three things, the breathing, the music, and the body work, they brought them together. And sure enough, this was a methodology that created very powerful experiences where people could access the perinatal and the transpersonal domains. And so that was something that Grof kept doing at Esalen in his month-long workshops. He was there for 14 years. And then after he left Esalen in 1987, he and Christina Grof started a training program so that they could train facilitators in doing this as well. And it's still happening. I've experienced it myself multiple times. I have students who've done it. And, the question everyone asks about breathwork is, yeah, but is it as potent as an LSD experience? And the amazing thing is it is extreme. It can be extremely potent. It can be extremely transformative. These containers are very well held and facilitated. And people do experience their births again. They have transpersonal encounters. It's different than a psychedelic experience in some ways. It takes more work and physical engagement. But there's also the blessing that it's substance free, it's legal, and it's if it becomes too overwhelming, you can stop, which is something you can't do with a psychedelic substance. So I think it's something I highly recommend people look into if they're wanting to work with expanded states of consciousness. But because of the legal situation today, can't work with LSD or another psychedelic, or would like a safer entree into that world. Psychedelics are not something to be taken lightly at all. And breathwork is a really great way to experience these kinds of states of consciousness.
I was wondering whether this is answerable, the 14th question. Do you think you can give an answer to that?
I do, because Grof has actually written about this. So distinguishing between a spiritual emergency or spiritual crisis and a psychiatric disorder, what Grof says is you first need to do a very careful assessment of the person, first to rule out, are there any physical reasons that could be causing this? Sometimes psychiatric disorders have a biological basis. So first ruling that out, a good medical examination, and then a good psychiatric examination. And the main difference that he holds in assessing, is this a spiritual crisis or is this a psychiatric disorder, is how the patient talks about it. And so if they're talking about, I'm having these experiences, of encounters with gods, or of these mythological sequences or something like that, and they're able to speak about it in a way that the content is very fantastical, out there. A psychiatrist might have a hard time believing it, but they're able to speak about it in a kind of clear, grounded, intelligent way, versus if they're speaking about it in a kind of paranoid or delusional way of feeling like, oh, my neighbor is uh out to get me, and they're kind of they're projecting the experience out onto the world itself. Then Grof holds it more in the category of this is needing psychiatric treatment, versus this is someone where if we can have people sitting with them and hold them through the experience, it can be integrated and so forth. And sometimes it can be tricky to determine too. And this is, I think, where our psychiatric system is very ill-equipped to hold space for these kinds of experiences. The ideal would be, can you keep someone physically safe and allow them to undergo what's emerging for them in a way where they can lean into it, where they can experience it fully, be transformed by it, and ultimately emerge on the other side. We don't have systems, at least in this country, that offer that. The psychiatric system is way too quick to medicate, tranquilize, hospitalize, diagnoses,
Yes. Yeah.
psychotic and so forth. So, but that's kind of the main way that he makes that distinction, which he writes about in his books on spiritual emergency.
Question 15, death and consciousness.
Mm-hmm. So the reason that death and dying,
Let me ask
sure.
Elisabeth Kübler-Ross with Thanatology.
Mm.
Did they meet? Did Stan Grof meet Kübler-Ross ever? Do you know that?
That's a good question. You I don't know. This is one of those moments where I'm like, I need to look back at who was invited to all the different ITA conferences, because they might have met.
Okay.
Um, yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay. Would
There's a
would
notebook here that probably has an answer to
would
that.
you say that there's a parallel in their views?
Um, I think I don't know Kubler-Ross's work well enough to answer that very clearly,
Okay.
but um, as the little that I do know, I think that there is a certain parallel in their views.
Well,
Um,
she is the first researcher, and as a woman with near-death experiences, I think even before Stan Grof came to that subject. So
that
this
makes
might
sense.
be interesting to look into.
It, when you ask if they met, it's ringing bells, but I don't want to say something that I'm not certain of.
Yeah, okay.
Um, Grof is definitely interested in the near-death experience research. Um, and there's a lot of parallels between what people describe in near-death experiences and what has been described coming out of certain, LSD sessions and so forth.
So
Kind of,
in your next contact with Stan, just ask him.
yeah, no, that's a good question.
Okay.
Um, well, and let me just add, the reason that death and dying and near-death experiences is so important in his work is because at the end of his time working in Baltimore, um, he was working with terminally ill cancer patients who, unlike all the rest of the patients that they were working with, who were only permitted to do 3 LSD sessions, and that was the limit, because they had a terminal diagnosis, they could do as many as they wanted. And there was a tremendous alleviation of fear around dying that would happen in these sessions. Encounters with their illnesses, kind of contextualization of the dying process, and a sense of, we've talked about how Grof came to this understanding of consciousness not being generated by matter, by the brain, but um, existing beyond that. And the research into death and dying definitely affirmed it. One of his books, for anyone who's interested in exploring that more deeply, is called The Ultimate Journey. And it has beautiful case studies of patients that Stan worked with, all of whom passed away not long after they were working together because of their diagnoses. So
I
um,
think we covered question 16. Would you agree?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah.
Psychedelic Renaissance.
Yeah, I mean, we've really been seeing this revival of psychedelic research in the last 2 decades in particular, and a push towards legalization of, MDMA psychotherapy, for example, psilocybin. Um, Interestingly, LSD hasn't had the same role to play in the Renaissance as it did in the Revolution back in the 50s and 60s. I think because it's an LSD session lasts about twice as long as a psilocybin session. It demands a lot, both of patient and therapist. Um, there, I think in the the 2010s in particular, there was a really major kind of arc in terms of acceptance of psychedelic uh, psychotherapy, and that these are healing medicines and so forth. I think in the last several years, we've seen more pushback against that. Um, the MDMA trials, for example, in the United States, after going through 3 rounds, didn't get approved. It's a complex situation, to be sure. And um, there's while the push towards legalization and really is falling under a kind of medical model, um, there's pushback from other sides, recognizing that there's also a spiritual and ceremonial context, and um, how do we honor all of the different indigenous traditions and shamanic cultures that have been working with sacred medicines and so forth for millennia. And so I think there's some fear that in the process of legalization, psychedelics will become corporatized, will become, kind of used like another pharmaceutical, that big money and power and so forth will come in. And I think those are very legitimate fears. And at the same time, Grof is certainly in support, and I'm certainly in support of um, these substances no longer being Schedule 1. Again, this is how it's classified in the United States, where they're seen as having no therapeutic value and being highly addictive, neither of which is true. Um, Two very brief anecdotes on Grof's perspective around this. When Rick Doblin was founding MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Science, and initiating the clinical trials, particularly into MDMA psychotherapy. And he went to Stan to ask, well, what would your advice be in terms of, how do we do this right this time? And pardon my language with this, but it's a direct quote from Stan. His basic advice was, don't fuck it up.
Very good.
Because that's essentially what happened in the 60s. Was people were reckless and careless, and
Yes, yes.
it wasn't treated with the seriousness that was needed. So that was his advice. And then the other thing that I think is worth mentioning about Grof is, at one point several years ago, he was approached by one of these for-profit corporations that wants to get into the psychedelic field, and they said, we'd love to have you on our board. We'll pay you handsomely for the rest of your life to do that. And Grof turned it down. He felt that that would compromise his kind of ethical stance in relation to
Yeah.
this research. So he's very scientifically oriented, but he's also someone who does have a deep respect for the indigenous cultures that have cultivated relationships with, whether it's ayahuasca or ibogaine or psilocybin or any of these other plant and fungal medicines that um, a corporate and pharmaceutical approach will just never um, honor in the way that they deserve.
Yeah.
And so I know that's very important to Grof too.
I was wondering, Robert Kennedy Jr., before he became a member of the Trump administration,
Yeah.
would you know whether there was any contact with the Grof movement?
I don't believe there was. Yeah, I think I would have heard that.
Okay,
But I do know, of course, that he's quite interested in the legalization of psychedelics and so forth.
okay.
Yeah.
Consciousness and cultural transformation.
Hmm. This is something that Groff will often end his books speaking about, where he feels that the what we're facing today in terms of the poly crisis, whether that's ecological or um, economic or spiritual crises of our times, um, war, conflict, greed, violence. Um, he feels that the shift in consciousness that people can go through in a well held psychedelic or expanded state of consciousness, that transformation of consciousness essentially will allow people to m- move into a different kind of relationship with each other and with the earth community. Um, he says that people who do this work in a very serious way leave the work transformed, that they no longer see other human groups as other or as the enemy, and that he really feels that that kind of transformation of consciousness um, is possible by working with expanded states of consciousness. Um,
Did
you
you
know
did,
what?
did you in that context ever thought about or researched about the phenomenon about the hatred against Russia by the Americans? The American society is sort of possessed by a daimon. Everything against Russia is good, and the Russians are bad, and it's subhumans and all that. This is a strange situation in the United States against Russia, and the same happens against the Iranian culture,
Yeah,
civilization of 5,000 years. Do you have, did you ever think about that problem, and did you have a sort of speculation answer where this comes from? Is that a
yeah.
compensation for a declining empire, or is it something more evil?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, the United States definitely uh, has a tendency to position itself as the hero in relation to cultures that it deems as the dragon.
Yes, yes,
Um,
obviously, obviously, and
yeah,
and it drags the whole world into a war. I mean, and in an economic catastrophe. But I was wondering, not talking about politics here, because otherwise this video will be cancelled by YouTube. But taking Grof's approach of cultural transformation,
yeah.
do you have an explanation of the American cultural transformation? Because when America was founded with the founders, they didn't cultivate this sort of behavior.
Well, America has a deep shadow that it's, I think finally starting to face more collectively as it's coming more obviously to the surface in the last several years. Um, based in its own founding and history. I mean, the the founding of the United States as the kind of the two foundational sins of the United States being the genocide of indigenous peoples and takeover of native land, and then enslaving Africans and
Yes,
kind of
yes.
building the whole economic foundation of the United States on that. I mean, that's such a deep shadow in the very foundations of this country that any kind of posturing that the country has in terms of seeing itself as heroic or in some way able to police the behavior of other nations around the world is highly hypocritical in my view.
How
Um,
about how about would you go as far? Well, we have this book by Dorian Gisela Greenbaum about the diamond in Hellenistic antiquity. And we know that diamonds are not only the good spirits, but the very bad, evil spirits as well. Would you go as far as that there is a very potent daimon acting in the society of your country, which is only possible to get rid of by exorcism.
Mm. It's that particular language I think aligns well with how I've often thought about it, that there's a kind of archetypal possession state that
Yes,
this
that
country
that
is
that
in.
would be the same thing. Yeah, yeah,
And similar in the way I've been describing that, when one casts themselves as the hero or the light, they become blind to the shadow or who they're projecting the
yeah.
enemy or the demon upon. And
How is your personal approach to this problem of the diamond in the spiritual world?
mm,
I believe Stan Grof knows a little bit about that because he met Satan himself in one of his sessions. How is your
yeah.
personal experience with the evil spiritual world? Any anecdotes you can elaborate on?
Um, I mean, the story that you're referencing with Groff, where he does have this encounter with one of his patients where she seems to go into a full possession state. the
Yes,
the
yes,
devil steps forward and introduces himself in a male voice. Her face is completely contorted and different.
yeah. It was a,
um
a typical situation where you need an exorcist normally.
he even said, he's like, gosh, we're gonna have to bring a crucifix in as part of our
Yes,
uh
yes.
psychedelic paraphernalia to help cast out this demonic presence. And bless the nurse who was in there with him as the co-facilitator. She was a Catholic, practicing Catholic, and here the devil's manifesting in the room with them.
Did
Uh,
he did he know that exorcism is a lot more difficult than he might have thought about it?
Probably not. I think his approach that day, he noticed that his fear and anger in response to this presence was feeding it. It was kind of feeding
Yeah,
off that.
yeah,
And so
yeah.
his approach instead was to take this woman's hand. It was all kind of cramped, claw-like. He took her hand and he meditated and visualized pure light surrounding them for 2 hours. It was about 2 hours of clock time. He said it
Was
was the
it was it
longest.
was it active imagination of the light?
Um, I don't know if he would use that term necessarily, but yeah, I think that would be a good way to describe it, a kind of active imagination of the light, or he uses the term meditation, which
Okay, okay,
I've often described active imagination as a form of meditation.
okay. How about yourself? Any personal experience with the most evil entities thinkable of?
I'm very grateful that I have not had a direct encounter of that nature.
How
I
about how
have,
about relatives, friends, colleagues, books? Anything comes to mind where
yeah,
you sort of in second line ex got some insight in that problem?
based on experiences, that range that you're describing, I definitely hold the perspective that evil is evil is an entity, a presence, that it has ontological reality, that it can possess human individuals or movements and so forth. Um, I very much struggle to understand what the metaphysical role of that is, other than, I think isn't it Ramakrishna who said, it's to thicken the plot. um,
Well,
which, it's a kind of a lighthearted response, but yeah, it's something that I definitely struggle with in terms of really understanding that metaphysically. But I do believe that there are evil entities or uh, archetypal principles that bend towards greed, violence, injustice, that are very much part of the world that we have to contend with.
does this mean that we probably are not thinking long enough in how people like yourself or of the movement of Stan Grof or of the archetypal cosmologists are a little bit too individualistic and that they are not willing enough to build a group? Because if you build groups with the same conviction. You can start building force fields, and out of the force fields comes the egregors, and out of the egregors comes a potent new archetype who could fight this evil. There's
Mm.
no movement to go into that direction as far as you know.
Not as far as I know at this time, but you never know how things will evolve in the future.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Question 19, the human being behind the scholar.
Mm. I think some of the things that have really surprised me have come from Stan's early life. And I do want to save a lot of these stories for the biography itself, but um, he was a rascal growing up.
Okay,
He was
okay.
he was a wild child, and it's really interesting to see the development of someone. Here's a nice little anecdote that tells it. Uh, this is a little bit later in his life, but he was raised. Well, his father, I'll say this, his father and his father's siblings, they're very, very poor, and they basically fed their family of 11, 9 children, 11 total, by collecting wild food and hunting, and a lot of stealing of fruits and things from people's farms and orchards, or the hedgerows in between farms, fields, and so forth. And Stan inherited some of that in terms of, as a child, going in and stealing fruit and uh, other things from people's gardens. And when he was older and had a car to drive, if he saw an animal on the road, he would turn his car to try and hit it to bring it home for dinner. Um, and contrast that approach from earlier in his life to when he's driving through Big Sur. And there's a certain time of year in Big Sur, and it used to be a lot more abundant than it is now, sadly, when the monarch butterflies stop on their migration in the Big Sur coast. And if you look at the trees along the cliffs in Big Sur, they are covered. It almost looks like
Yes.
the trees are orange flowers, just undulating, because there's millions of these butterflies, and they would be all over Highway 1. And Stan's motto as he drove down Highway 1 was, "I brake for butterflies." Like, he would drive so slowly so as not to hit a single butterfly. And that evolution, I think, is just extraordinary to witness. And it was exactly, as we've been talking about, entering into these transpersonal experiences where you identify as the butterfly and the whale, and just drop my water. As you identify as the butterfly, the whale, the sequoia tree, and so forth. That it's a new form of empathy is developed, and I think that's something just amazing to see in his own evolution. But that was some of what surprised me a little bit too, in terms of his early years. Just what a wild child he was.
How about question number 20? And I would add, what are the challenges and what are the highlights? Was there a specific highlight, unbelievable gift from the heavens which happens in your research? And was there on the opposite side a very frustrating situation in your research on the biography?
Um, yeah, I mean, it's in terms of kind of balancing that admiration for his work, and critical stance. That's something that, as I'm writing the biography, I'm always reminding myself, because I do love Stan Grof deeply as a person and care about him as an individual. I think his work has a tremendous amount to offer. At the same time, I'm not writing a hagiography. I'm not kind of trying to put him on a pedestal. And I think I'm showing the very human sides of him, in terms of, sometimes it can be biases or presuppositions that inform his work. Sometimes it's more on the relational side, um, but while writing it in a very, very human way, and trying to kind of step back as I write those parts, so that there is more of an objective approach, or that the reader is left to make their own judgments or have their own perspective. And in terms of this question of things that are in the process of either kind of felt like grace or been very frustrating, I mean, let me ask you, in terms of answering this question, do you mean more about his life story, or just my process in terms of
Now, I give you an
writing?
I give you an example. The PhD
Please.
student Helena Avila was working in the Warburg Institute about an astrologer of 1498 in France, S. Belle, and she was in contact with Charles Burnett of the Warburg Institute. And when she visited London, she was there for 4 years with a grant of the Portuguese government. And when she was there, Charles Burnett mentioned her, "Oh, David Just is in the house. I think he has something, a comparable man." She had a manuscript. She had found a manuscript in the archives of the French Royal Archives. And Charles Burnett said, "Oh, David Just has something comparable like that." And they met in the copy where the copy machine was, and he had his laptop with him. David Just, I had interviews with both of them on my channel, and David just had a manuscript on his laptop, and it was the same author. It was S. Belle,
Mm.
but on his manuscript the name was mentioned, and this was an extremely highlight in the research of a person like Helen Avila. Anything like that, an extremely research highlight which you
Mm.
did not expect to meet. And then,
Yeah.
on the other hand, working on the archives in history of astrology, for example, it's sometimes extremely frustrating. How about your research project with the biography of Stan Grof? Any highlights of that level and
Mm.
on the other side as well? Or is it a smooth research and there was no real, like finding a gold nugget,
Yeah.
which you didn't expect?
I mean, I think the gold nuggets really have been in the interviews that I've done with people.
Okay.
Um, so I've conducted a lot of interviews with Grof's colleagues, friends, family members, and so forth. And just the stories that I have been privileged to that haven't been published, those have been definitely, gold mine.
Yes, okay, okay.
And so that has been a real gift, especially when it comes to the the later stages of his life, kind of especially around the 1970s, 80s, 90s. There's just so much material that and stories people have been willing to share with me. And um, kind of, piecing all that together. I think more of the frustrations have just simply been in the realities of my own life, where, I started doing this research in 2022, and I got pregnant with my first child in 2023. And so now I'm pregnant with my second child, and just balancing researching and writing the biography with um, raising a family, and then also teaching full time.
And there was
Um,
some private aspect we won't talk about as well in the same time.
um, there, other things going on at
Yeah,
the same time.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So, um, the, it, I was naive, I think, when I first took on the project, thinking of how long it would take. And, that has been a very humbling but important lesson for me to do justice to, Stan is 95 years old. He has lived a very full life. And every single era of his life has been rich with extraordinary stories, ones that again and again, when I take them in, I just think, how is this possible? How did this one person have so many different extraordinary experiences, encounters, meeting different people? It's not like it was just concentrated in one era. And so to really do justice to it, it has taken a lot longer. Plus, all the personal reasons. So that, I would say, has been a frustration. And at the same time, I'm learning more to trust in that timing, because the way that the writing is flowing through me now, in my telling of this story, I don't think that would have been possible or available to me a few years ago, just based on my own maturational process and familiarity with the work and teaching on it and so on. So
Do
I
you
was,
do
yeah.
you experience that like your personal guardian angel is constituting that flow, or do
Mm,
you have a feeling that there are higher hierarchies as well involved because they want this
mm.
thing to happen?
It's more of that, the latter feeling of kind of being part of a larger orchestration that I don't even fully understand. Um,
Higher hierarchies than just your guardian angel then. Okay.
I think so, because it
Mm.
doesn't feel like it just, and the reason I say this too is because I'm not writing my story. I'm writing somebody else's story,
Yes, yes, yes.
and a work that involves the lives and careers and so forth of many other people. And so because of that, it does feel like it's something beyond like me and my own personal trajectory. Um, and this has felt like it's a project that's really felt like an offering of service, not just to Stan, but to the work that he has been doing and all the people it's affected. And that going right back to the beginning of our conversation is why I do want to write this in a way that feels really accessible to people beyond the field of psychedelic studies and psychotherapy and so forth, people who've already heard of Stan Grof. My goal is to have this story reach people who want a good life story to read, of someone who underwent a profound evolution of consciousness, and maybe, just maybe, it will evolve their own consciousness as well in the process.
And I like to change the last question and go out of the
Sure.
questions. I think reducing the question, what is the one thing? It's not a good question. But what I'd like to ask you instead is, how do you see the scenery of the disciples and the groupies of Stan Grof's work? In one of the videos I watched with Brigitta, there was a Canadian guy who is sort of, well, yesterday in my interview with Richard Tarnas, before we started the interview, he asked me why I did so much work about him, because I did since 2000 homepages
Mm-hmm.
about him. And I said, well, I was a groupie since 2000 in Lucerne when I met you and Stan Grof in this webinar. So I'm a groupie of Richard Tarnas, sort of. And I follow your work not as a groupie, but as very interested since 2018. And the same happens with Stan Grof. He has students, disciples, colleagues, and groupies worldwide. How large is that movement of people who admire him, who are colleagues on, inspired by his work? Is there a school of Stan Grof? Like
Mm.
in philosophy, you have schools of Heidegger school, or phenomenological schools. How about your impression of the Stan Grof movement of people who have been in contact with him, who have been trained by him, who are continue his work all over the world, in Germany as well? How do you see that scene worldwide?
To give you a very distinct image of what this looked like, when I went to the Psychedelic Science Conference in 2023,
Yes,
I saw people like at one point. I was walking down the hallway with Stan, and um, multiple people are turning. Oh my gosh, it's Stan Grof! There he is, and this kind of um, sense of awe around his presence. One person came and knelt at his feet, kissed his feet,
like a rock
um,
star, like a rock star.
kind of like a rock star. And at the exact same conference, because I was there with my badge that said biographer, and that this was why I was able to go to the conference. And I'd be in conversation with someone in line for something, and there were plenty of people who'd never even heard of Stan Grof. So you had that mix at the psychedelic conference right there, where I don't know what the numbers would be necessarily, but everything from a kind of hero worship, like a guru is walking through, to who are you talking about? And so there are certain people where his work has absolutely changed their lives. and they do have that deeply reverent orientation toward him. Um, he receives plenty of criticism too from those further afield who maybe know his work, but don't agree with it for whatever reason or feel it's too spiritual or too mystical. They don't like the conclusions that he's landed on. There's a lot of people, interestingly, who really admire his work up until archetypal astrology. And then they're like, are you kidding? You've lost us. Like you were doing so well. And then you brought in this astrology thing. But in terms of there isn't a school of Grof at this point. There is, of course, the Grof legacy training, which teaches holotropic breath work. Originally, Stan and his late wife, Christina, founded the Grof transpersonal training. And that's still an organization that's running. There's been a split between the two, and Grof has started his own training program that basically it's a nonprofit. The other one's for profit. That was part of the split. And so that's kind of where his work, particularly the holotropic breathwork, is being housed, the Grof legacy training and project.
Is it basically Brigitte and Stan himself, or is there a larger supporting group behind that?
It's larger. So there's different international organizations under that umbrella. There's one in the United States that's led by Diane Haug. There's another one in Canada, another one in Spain. I think there's one in Chile. There's others that I.
How about the problem we talked about in our last talk about the Archai journal? Those are people today, and it's a wonderful work they're doing. How is it made secure that there will be followers in their footsteps? Or is it a danger that if those people present at the day supporting Stan Grof, let's say he becomes 105 and dies when he's 105 or 110, you never know how long he lives.
Yeah.
But if he does the right thing in my homepage, Bürgertreff Gesundheit, I advise people how they can get to the age of 110. So it's possible if you do the right things, but you do have to do different. For example, you should take Strophantine, Strophanthus gratus every day, and you wouldn't get a stroke. So Stan Grof didn't know that, so he wouldn't have had those strokes if he had known this. So there is information available to become very old. And we know about the blue zones, why people become so old. But someday he will not be with us anymore. And that the same will be true for Brigitte. And in 50 or 70 years, in your case, you will be gone. So 100 years from now, do you think there will be enough followers? Or is there a danger that this is a temporary situation with the legacy and then the legacy becomes in peril? How do you
It,
see the scene?
it's a good question. And, I can kind of see either scenario playing out in some ways where what I have noticed is usually after someone's passing, their work kind of receives a new level of attention. And so I could
That is
see
possible.
how
It could be a world movement. Yeah, yeah.
that's definitely a possibility. That's the possibility I'm writing my biography for, in some ways, of that kind of ripple effect where someone enters the collective in a new way after their passing. I do think, though, that some of the organizations that have been especially connected to Stan or dependent upon him, it'll just depend on the fortitude and kind of interest of those people running, the different factions of the trainings and so forth.
Yeah, yeah.
I tend one way to just kind of wrap this up would be, as a student of my father's as well, and what he's laid out in his writings, particularly The Passion of the Western Mind, I tend to think in that longer term sense too, where, you see the Copernican revolution, for example. Copernicus publishes De Revolutionibus on his deathbed. De Revolutionibus, pardon my bad pronunciation, on his deathbed. And there's no sense that this is going to go anywhere necessarily. It's 50 years later that it's picked up in a new way by, Kepler, Galileo, and others, and then finalized
Yes.
with
Yeah.
Newton. So I tend to think in those longer term scales, and that it could be, that there's kind of a dying out of a movement around Grof's work in the decades following his passing. His work is out there, though.
Oh,
And I do think he offers something that the world needs. And in that way, who knows when it might get picked up again.
let's focus on CIIS and Pacifica. How do
Mm-hmm.
you see your colleagues? Is there an impetus to do something like that, to take up the baton and go on with it? So a follower of Stan Grof, not you, but somebody
Mm-hmm.
else.
Mm-hmm.
Are you the only one, or is there a colleague in CIS and our colleagues in Pacifica who are so convinced of the work of Stan Grof that they dedicate the rest of their life to this
Mm.
work? Or are you the only one?
Um, at Pacifica, I don't know how much. I don't think Grof is very well embedded there. They're more oriented toward Jung, Hillman,
Well,
Campbell.
excuse me,
Um,
my frustration. Stan Grof is in the center of Jung and Hillman.
mhm.
If you
Yeah.
take what he's doing, and
Yeah.
if people in Pacifica are not recognizing that, they are dumb.
I can't specifically say what's happening at Pacifica at this point. At CIIS, Grof is being taught in by a number of different people. I'm teaching him in my way in the philosophy of
Yes,
cosmology and consciousness program, but
yes.
there's also CIIS has the psychedelic assisted psychotherapy certificate, and
Oh,
Grof's
good. Yeah,
work is part of that.
yeah,
That's a very
that's
thriving certificate
yeah.
program.
So
CIIS just
there is a seed there.
there's definitely a seed there. There's definitely multiple people in different programs, different psychology programs teaching Grof um, as part of kind of a larger context. But it's not, you wouldn't look at CIS and necessarily say, oh, that's the Grof school. It's
Yeah,
still kind of spread out a bit.
it's a shame. Okay, I accept that. Um, in
That's where
20
we're at right now, at least.
in 2028, you plan to publish your biography. How about the publisher? Any contacts already?
Hold that date very lightly because you probably found that on my website. I've moved that date back um, year by year, and so I don't know. I don't know who the publisher will be at this point.
Do you
Um,
intend to contact a European publisher like Brill or Springer, or do you intend to contact publishers in the States?
I'll start with publishers in the States, but my intention is for it to have an international audience.
Well,
So
why wouldn't you consider the European heavyweights like Springer, Brill, and De Gruyter, which are European publishers?
I wouldn't rule it out.
Okay, okay.
So we'll just see at the point that I'm ready to be bringing it to agents and to publishers. Um, we're going to cast a very wide net.
Very good. So, did we cover your research project sufficiently, or do you want to talk about something which we missed?
I think we covered it very thoroughly. I was so impressed, by the way, with the level of research behind the questions and the sequencing. So thank you for that.
Okay.
Yeah, it was lovely to read all of those questions in preparation. And I think anything else that I would discuss, uh, I want your listeners when they watch this video to come back around in a few years to read the biography itself.
Okay.
So
Okay.
anything else, I'll probably keep a little closer.
Anything to add from your private life? And for example, when the project is finished and might be the website as well, do you have already plans now what you want to do after that, or is that just wait and see?
Um, well, it's definitely going to depend how long it takes. I have multiple book projects that are down the line gestating in a few different genres that I'd love to write, but I also know myself well enough that I'll be burnt out probably after this one, at least for a little while.
If you had to
Yep.
choose and you could only choose one of your different possible projects after the biography research, what would it be? If you had to
I
decide today.
if I had to decide today, it would be a novel that has been quietly
Okay, very interesting.
telling itself within me for the last several years.
Novel in the category of science fiction or esoteric or spiritual aspects or another novel.
I think probably the best way to describe it would be spiritual, esoteric, bordering on fantasy, but not quite
Okay,
crossing that line.
okay.
Yeah.
Anything else, or did we come to an end?
I think we've covered a lot of
Okay,
good material, and
okay,
I'm sure there's always more. There, it's so enjoyable to speak with you, but
okay.
that's all that's kind of coming to mind at the moment.
So this will be uncut and unedited, so I will upload it after this talk, so it will be available on YouTube in 3 or 4 hours.
Okay.
And then I send you the MP4 for your personal use. So thank you from the side of the viewers who were with us up till now. And to tell you the truth, 86% of a solar eclipse is not that much. You don't see much.
Yeah.
It didn't get dark. It didn't get dark. Now it's the normal darkness outside.
Uh,
Okay, so I stopped the recording and thank you very much for taking the time again. And we
Thank you
will
too.
have it online in a couple of hours. So now let me see whether I can get rid of this Aufzeichnen and stop. I stopped the recording. Thank you.
Thank you.